Two officers, John Tinsley and Hank Allen, were stationed at their usual spot near the highway exit, watching for any suspicious vehicles or possible speeding drivers. John was young, fresh out of training, eager to impress. Hank, however, was a grizzled officer, years of patrol making him sharp but often wary of people from the city. Just as Hank took a sip from his cooling coffee, a sleek black van approached. Without any real reason, just a hunch, Hank decided they should check it out. "John," he said, his eyes narrowing. "Pull him over." "That one doesn't look right to me." John nodded, and the two officers signaled for the car to pull over. They had no idea that the man inside wasn't some regular driver. Instead, he was Thomas Lancer, head of internal affairs at the Brimwood Police Department, the very person who made sure officers like John and Hank followed the rules. Thomas rolled down his window as they approached, his gaze calm, and his face hidden in the dim evening light. "Good evening, officers," he said, his voice steady. Hank looked at him suspiciously, not recognizing who he was. "Evening. License and registration, please," Hank demanded, his tone firm but lacking any warmth. Thomas complied without hesitation, handing over his documents. But as Hank scanned the ID, his expression turned from suspicion to something else, a slight frown. He'd heard the name Thomas Lancer before. It was a name that carried weight in their department, a name some respected and others resented. John leaned in to glance at the ID, his eyebrows rising. Hank, you don't think." But Hank interrupted, unwilling to back down. "Why were you speeding, Mr. Lancer?" he asked, though Thomas hadn't actually been speeding. It seemed Hank wanted to find something, anything, that would give him authority here. "I wasn't speeding, Officer Allen," Thomas replied, his tone respectful. "Is there a problem?" John, sensing tension, looked between the two men. He knew Thomas was in charge of keeping the department clean and that Hank wasn't exactly a fan of internal affairs. But right now, they were walking on thin ice, and John wasn't sure if they should be questioning a man like Lancer without cause. But Hank, stubborn as ever, refused to let it go. "You sure about that? Maybe we should search the car just to be sure you're not carrying anything you shouldn't be." Thomas didn't flinch, only looking at the two men with a quiet, steady gaze. "If you insist, Officer Allen. But I'd like to remind you that you are speaking to the head of internal affairs. I hope you understand the protocols that come with that." Hank froze. John's face paled. They'd crossed a line, and they knew it. But for Hank, pride kept him rooted in place. "Protocol or not," he grumbled, "we're doing our job here." Thomas said nothing further, watching them carefully as the tension grew thick. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. With a reluctant nod, Hank gestured for Thomas to step out of the car. "Please step out, Mr. Lancer," he said, his voice holding a hint of unease now. John was watching, his hands fidgeting at his sides, unsure of how to handle the situation. Thomas got out slowly, standing tall, his expression unreadable. "This is highly unusual, officers," he said, looking straight at Hank. "Is there a specific reason for the search?" Hank didn't respond, but John quickly jumped in. "We're just doing a routine check, sir. Nothing personal." He glanced nervously at Hank, who shot him a warning look. Thomas gave a short nod and stepped aside, watching as Hank started to search through the car. John stood awkwardly by, clearly uncomfortable but not wanting to challenge his senior officer. A few minutes into the search, Hank's face twisted with frustration as he found nothing out of place. He slammed the car door shut a little harder than necessary, drawing Thomas's calm gaze back to him. Satisfied? Thomas asked quietly. Hank bristled. Not yet. Let's have a look in the trunk. John's eyes widened. Hank, maybe that's enough, he whispered, hoping his partner would listen. We've done what we needed. We're good here. But Hank was determined to prove something, even if he wasn't sure what. He motioned for Thomas to pop the trunk, his jaw set in stubborn defiance. Thomas, clearly unimpressed but cooperative, pressed the button. The trunk opened to reveal nothing but a neat set of work materials and a spare tire. But just as Hank leaned closer to look, he stumbled back, gripping his shoulder in shock. Out of nowhere, Thomas's police badge glinted under the car light as he pulled it from his pocket, raising it for both officers to see. I think we've done enough here, officers, he said firmly, his voice carrying a quiet authority. John gulped, eyes wide, feeling the weight of the situation finally sink in. Hank, finally realizing he was out of his depth, let out a bitter sigh and muttered, Let's wrap this up. But Thomas wasn't finished. Thomas took a step forward, his gaze locked on Hank. You know, Officer Allen, misuse of authority isn't something I take lightly. I'll be filing a full report on this incident. Brimwood doesn't need officers who think they're above the law. Hank clenched his fists, but he knew he had no defense. Thomas's badge and title made any argument pointless. John, sensing the gravity of the moment, stepped forward. Mr. Lancer, please. We were just doing our job. There was no harm meant. His voice was pleading, hoping to ease the tension. Thomas regarded him with a faint smile. John, you're new, and I can see that you tried to do the right thing. I'll make sure that goes into the report. But Allen here, well, that's another story. Hank looked at John, his face pale, realizing the consequences of what they'd done. This is gonna ruin me, he muttered under his breath, his confidence crumbling. Thomas turned, walking back to his car, but not before leaving them with one last reminder. Next time, officers, think twice before you pull someone over without cause. Justice isn't just a word, it's what holds us all to account. Good night. With that, Thomas drove off, leaving John and Hank standing there in silence. The lesson was clear. Authority came with responsibility, and the abuse of it had consequences. As Thomas disappeared into the night, the weight of his words lingered in the air, a powerful reminder that justice isn't about power, it's about the truth. And for officers like Hank and John, it was a lesson they would never forget. And this brings us to the end of this story. Thank you for watching till the end. I hope you enjoyed the story. If you did, don't hesitate to like the video and share it with your friends too. Subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell for more fascinating stories. Have a nice day.